Welcome back, true crime fans. Ready for another deep dive?
Oh, absolutely. Always up for a journey into the dark side of humanity.
Well, you know me, always digging into the cases that keep you up at night.
And today's subject is certainly one for the sleepless nights. Jeffrey Dahmer.
Ugh, Dahmer. I mean, the name alone sends shivers down your spine, right?
It does. One
Yeah.
of the most notorious serial killers in American history.
Absolutely. And I think what's so disturbing about this case is it's not just the sheer brutality of his crimes. It's the psychology behind them. What drove this seemingly ordinary guy to commit such horrific acts?
Right, peeling back the layers to try and understand the making of a monster. It's like,
Yeah.
what went wrong? How does a human being become capable of such depravity?
And thankfully, you've brought in a ton of sources today. We've got biographical information, psychological analyses, even some of Dahmer's own words.
Trying to piece it all together, get as complete a picture as possible.
Exactly. So let's start in the beginning, shall we? Dahmer's childhood. It wasn't exactly a Norman Rockwell painting, was it?
Far from it. Troubled family dynamics, constant fighting between his parents, feeling isolated, emotionally neglected.
Right, and there's this idea in forensic psychology that early childhood trauma can be a breeding ground for all sorts of issues later in life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not a guarantee, but it's definitely a risk factor.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about things like antisocial personality disorder.
And it's interesting because even as a child, Dahmer had this morbid fascination with death.
Yeah, started with insects, like a lot of kids,
Huh.
collecting them, but then it escalated.
Yeah, from insects to dissecting roadkill, then even mutilating animals.
Disturbing, right? I mean, for most kids, curiosity about death is a passing phase, but for some, it takes on a darker significance, especially when it's coupled with a lack of empathy. That can be a serious red flag.
Right, it becomes less about curiosity and more about, I don't know, a kind of morbid control.
Exactly. It's almost like they're testing boundaries, seeing how far they can go. And tragically, with Dahmer, this pattern of behavior just continued to escalate.
And it all culminated in 1978, his first murder.
In the woods. Same woods where he used to dismember animals, which is just, ugh, the symbolism's chilling, isn't it?
So creepy. I mean, it's almost like those woods became a training ground for his later atrocities, a place where he could indulge his darkest urges without consequence.
And the victim, Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker Dahmer, picked up. At first glance, it seems random, a crime of opportunity.
But you have to wonder, was it really so random? Given Dahmer's history, his fascination with control, with death.
Right, and the brutality of the murder itself. I mean, it wasn't just a killing, it was a complete dehumanization. Bludgeoning, strangulation, dissolving the body in acid, pulverizing the bones. That's not just about ending a life, it's about erasing it.
It's methodical, almost ritualistic. And I think it speaks to a level of premeditation that's really disturbing.
Absolutely. He was experimenting, rehearsing for what was to come.
And then there's this 9-year gap before his next murder. He joins the army, struggles with alcohol, eventually moves to Milwaukee.
Crucial period, I think. It's like a pressure cooker, On the surface, he's living a somewhat normal life. But underneath, those compulsions are simmering, intensifying.
And Milwaukee becomes the epicenter of his terror. He gets a job at a chocolate factory, frequents gay bars, and his method of selecting victims, it's chillingly calculated.
Targeting men who were unlikely to be missed. Those living on the margins of society, People whose disappearances wouldn't raise immediate alarms. It's like he studied the cracks in the system and knew exactly how to exploit them.
And it speaks to a level of awareness, a coldness that's just, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Right, he knew exactly who to target, who would slip through the cracks. It's a terrifying example of how societal inequalities can be manipulated by predators. And in Milwaukee, his crimes escalate. It's not just about killing anymore. It's about possession, control.
Yeah, the drugging, the strangulation, the dissolving of bodies in acid. But it's more than that, isn't it? He wanted to keep them, to preserve them.
It's where we see the necrophilia, the desire to possess his victims even after death. And the term paraphilia refers to intense and persistent sexual interests other than those considered typical, right? So in Dahmer's case, we're talking about his interest in corpses, his desire to keep body parts as trophies, deeply, deeply disturbing stuff.
And it's not just the paraphilias, right? There's this insatiable need for power, a desire to dominate his victims completely.
Oh, absolutely. It went beyond just taking a life. He wanted to exert absolute control, to manipulate, to possess.
And one of the most disturbing aspects of this need for control was his attempt to create zombies through these crude lobotomies.
drilling holes into his victims' skulls, injecting muriatic acid into their brains. It was this horrific and ultimately futile attempt to erase their personalities, to turn them into submissive beings.
It's beyond comprehension. It's like he wanted to play God to create these beings that he could completely control.
It speaks to a profound level of psychological disturbance. And sadly, there were missed opportunities to stop him before his crimes escalated to this point, like the incident with Conorak Sinthasomfo.
That poor boy, 14 years old,
Yeah.
escaped from Dahmer's apartment, naked and disoriented.
Mm.
But when the police arrived,
They believed Dahmer's lies, sent the boy back to him.
it's just heartbreaking. And it's a stark reminder of how societal biases, particularly against marginalized communities, can have such devastating consequences.
Absolutely. I mean, those women who called the police, they tried to warn them, but their concerns were dismissed, and it allowed Dahmer to continue his reign of terror.
A tragic reminder that sometimes, even when people try to do the right thing, systemic failures can let predators slip through the cracks. And Dahmer was a master manipulator. He maintained this facade of normalcy, carefully concealing his crimes from the outside world.
A hallmark of many successful serial killers, isn't it? They blend in, they appear harmless, which makes their actions even more insidious. It's almost like they're living double lives, one of quiet horror hidden beneath a veneer of ordinariness.
It's chilling. And it makes you wonder, how many other Dahmers might be out there, lurking in plain sight?
That's a thought that should keep us all up at night, right? It challenges us to be more aware of our surroundings, to question our assumptions, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to talk about Dahmer's own words. He claimed to crave companionship, control, but then there's this disturbing element of cannibalism.
He talked about wanting to make his victims a part of him, to keep them with him forever, a level of psychological distortion that's really hard to comprehend.
It's truly disturbing. And while we're trying to understand the psychology behind his actions, it in no way excuses the horrific nature of his crimes. His victims were real people whose lives were tragically cut short. We can't lose sight of that.
Absolutely. Understanding is not condoning. It's about trying to piece together the puzzle, to glean insights that might help prevent future tragedies. And Dahmer's case, well, it's a puzzle with a lot of pieces, a lot of layers of darkness that we're only just beginning to unravel.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential psychological factors, the horrific nature of his crimes. But eventually, Dahmer's reign of terror had to come to an end. How did it all unravel?
It all came crashing down in July of 1991. One of his victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape.
Edwards, he was the one who had been handcuffed by Dahmer, right?
Yeah. But he saw an opportunity and bolted out of the apartment, flagged down some police officers, and what they found when they got inside Dahmer's apartment, well, let's just say it was a scene straight out of a nightmare.
I mean, you hear about the details, but it's hard to even fathom. Body parts in the refrigerator, photographs of his victims in various stages of dismemberment.
It was a house of horrors, plain and simple. The evidence was just overwhelming.
And so the arrest, the confession, the media just exploded, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the world was captivated, horrified, and not just by the brutality, but also by how he'd managed to evade detection for so long.
Right. He was living this double life, this seemingly ordinary guy committing these unspeakable acts.
And then came the trial, which quickly became a media circus.
It's like everyone wanted to know, would this monster be held accountable?
Exactly. And the trial itself, it started in January of 1992. And it was a strange one, because it wasn't about proving whether he was guilty or not. He'd already confessed.
So it became about his mental state, right? The whole question of sanity.
Exactly. The defense argued Dahmer was driven by these uncontrollable urges, that he was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions.
Trying to paint this picture of a man consumed by his compulsions.
Right, someone incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of what he was doing.
But the prosecution, they pushed back hard on that narrative, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They portrayed him as this cold, calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing.
Pointing to the meticulous planning, the careful victim selection, the attempts to cover his tracks.
Right, arguing that all that demonstrated awareness, control, that he wasn't legally insane.
And then you get into this whole legal definition of insanity, which is, well, it's pretty complex.
It really is. Because in most places, the insanity defense hinges on whether the defendant, at the time of the crime, understood what they were doing was wrong.
So the prosecution was basically saying, look, all of his actions point to awareness and control. He knew what he was doing.
Exactly. Using his meticulous methods, his normal outward appearance, all evidence that, legally speaking, he wasn't insane.
It must have been such an intense trial. Expert psychiatrists going back and forth trying to dissect Dahmer's mind.
It was. And the jury, I mean, what a heavy burden, right?
Ah.
Trying to delve into the mind of a monster.
And in the end, after 2 weeks of testimony and deliberation, they reached a verdict.
Guilty on all 15 counts of murder. Jeffrey Dahmer was found sane and responsible for his crimes.
Wow. I mean, a small victory for the families of his victims, I guess, to know that he would be held accountable. But even with a guilty verdict, can you ever really find closure in a case like this?
I don't think so. The trauma, the pain, it lingers.
Absolutely. So Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, sent to the Columbia Correctional Institute in Wisconsin. And it's interesting, there's some details about his life behind bars, specifically his newfound interest in religion.
Yeah, it's a fascinating twist. Reading the Bible, requesting to be baptized. After all the darkness he'd unleashed, it's hard to reconcile that with a genuine search for faith.
Right. It makes you wonder, was it real remorse, a desire for forgiveness,
Yeah.
or just another form of manipulation?
Unfortunately, we'll never really know what was going on in his mind. Because in 1994, just 2 years into his sentence, Dahmer was murdered by another inmate.
Christopher Scarver, right?
Yeah, and Scarver claimed he was driven by a sense of justice, that he couldn't bear the thought of Dahmer living out his days while his victims were gone.
A brutal end to an already horrifying story. It really makes you think about the cycle of violence, how it just seems to perpetuate itself.
And it's a grim reminder that the impact of these kinds of crimes, it extends far beyond the immediate victims. It affects families, communities, even the perpetrators themselves.
It's crazy to think that even though Dahmer's gone, the ripple effects of his crimes are still felt today. Like his apartment building was demolished in '92.
Yeah, they tore that whole place down, trying to erase the physical reminder of the horrors that happened there. But you can't just bulldoze away the memories, can you?
Not at all. The scars run deep. And it's interesting, one of the things that's always stuck with me is how he managed to fly under the radar for so long. I mean, here's this serial killer operating right in the open.
Yeah, blending in, maintaining this facade of normalcy while committing these truly monstrous acts. It's a chilling reminder that evil can wear an ordinary mask.
And it makes you wonder, are there other Dahmers out there?
Yeah.
People hiding in plain sight, leading these double lives.
It's a terrifying thought. And I think it challenges us to be more aware of our surroundings, to trust our gut instincts when something feels off.
We also can't forget about those photographs.
Yeah.
You know, the ones he took of his victims. So meticulously documenting his crimes.
It's a pattern we see in a lot of serial killers, this compulsion to record and preserve their handiwork. It's like a twisted form of control, a way of extending their power even after death.
And it speaks to a really disturbed psychology. It's like they need to relive it, savor it.
It's horrifying. And then you have the whole zombie thing, the lobotomies.
The idea of wanting to rob someone of their personality, their free will, just to turn them into some kind of puppet.
Ugh, it's a level of dehumanization that's hard to even process. And I think it all goes back to control.
So, yeah.
This deep-seated need to dominate, to possess. And for Dahmer, I think it stemmed from a profound fear of loss, of abandonment.
Like he was trying to compensate for his own feelings of powerlessness by exerting this horrific power over others. So after this deep dive into the darkness of Jeffrey Dahmer, where do we even begin to unpack it all?
I don't know if there are any easy answers. You know, with true crime, it's not always about finding neat conclusions. It's about grappling with the complexity of human nature, confronting the darkness that exists in all of us.
Dahmer was a monster, plain and simple. But his case forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about our society, the biases, the systemic failures that allowed him to operate for so long.
Absolutely. And it reminds us to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice whenever we see it, to maybe even question our own assumptions about who we perceive as dangerous.
Because sometimes evil hides behind the most ordinary facade, and that's a truly chilling thought. But by studying these cases, by understanding the darkness, maybe, just maybe, we can shed some light on how to prevent such horrors in the future. It's a continuous process.
Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, and it's a conversation we need to keep having.
Well said. And on that note, my friends, we come to the end of another deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.